all day. And thank you for coming and sharing this morning with us. Are you hearing this? Okay. And those of you who are new to the University Club or History Group or a guest, thank you for coming, and we're delighted to have you all here. Number one request, please. I see right away people going to their pockets. Turn your phones off, please, or put them away. Our next program will be Monday, March the 31st. We're giving you an extra, and it's going to be really different and exciting. Retired systems engineer and NASA, William Colleran, will present A Race to the Moon, a close call. The space race began as a competition between the world's two superpowers to launch an artificial satellite during the International Geophysical Year, which was 1957 to 1958. It quickly became a battle to prove which system, communism or liberal democracy, would prevail. In May 1961, and I think most of us remember, President John F. Kennedy set the ambitious goal of sending a man to the moon by the decade's end. Achieving this would require significant advancement in technology, management, and of course funding. The race was on. Our speaker, William Colleran, will help us to understand and relive that exciting and memorable time. And I think many of you, just like my family, ran out the door to watch everything go up because we were so blessed to be in a position we could watch it. So, I'll see you here on Monday, March 31st. That's 2 weeks from today for this wonderful presentation. Now, History Today, Monday, March 17th, 2025. In 432, St. Patrick, at age about 16, was captured by Irish pirates from his home in Great Britain and taken as a slave to Ireland. In 1756, St. Patrick's Day was first celebrated in New York City. In 1762, the first St. Paddy's Day parade was also held in New York City. And this is a biggie. In 1845, the rubber band was patented by Stephen Perry in London. In 1868, the postage stamp canceling machine patent was issued. In 1884, John Joseph Montgomery made the first glider flight in Oley, California. In 1894, United States and China signed a treaty preventing Chinese laborers from entering the United States. Nothing's new under the sun, is it? In 1898, John Philip Holland achieved the successful test run for the first modern submarine off Staten Island, submerging 1 hour and 40 minutes. In 1901, at a show in Paris, 71 of Vincent van Gogh's paintings caused a sensation 11 years after his death. In 1942, the Belzec concentration camp was opened and the transport of 30,000 Polish Jews. In 1944, Mount Vesuvius in Italy once again erupted and destroyed several towns. In 1965, eruptions of Mount Agong in Bali killed 1,900 Balinese. In 1969, Golda Meir became Israel's fourth prime minister and the first female to hold that office. In 2003, edging on the brink of war, President George W. Bush gave Iraq President Saddam Hussein 48 hours to leave his country. Iraq rejected Bush's ultimatum, saying a U.S. attack to force Saddam from power would be a grave mistake. In 2023, that's last year, 2 years ago, the International Criminal Court said it had issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin for war crimes because of his alleged involvement in abductions of children from Ukraine, which Russia invaded in 2022. In 2024, after suppressing and murdering opponents, President Vladimir Putin claimed a Soviet record election victory of 87.8 votes. And today's birthdays: American golfer Bobby Jones, American jazz pianist and pop vocalist Nat King Cole, American astronaut James Irwin, American actor Kurt Russell, American actor Rob Lowe, and I have to give you a chuckle, American pornographic actress Stormy Daniels. And now I turn the mic over to our wonderful co-chair, Dr. Ovid Vitas.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce today our speaker, Steve Bertha. Steve was born in Budapest, Hungary, and immigrated to Venezuela as a child, where he grew up. He holds a Bachelor in Sciences in Chemistry from the University of Pennsylvania, PhD in Chemistry from Florida State University. After completing his education, Steve returned to Venezuela, where he played a pivotal role in one of the as a founder and the head of the Department of Chemistry at the Simon Bolivar University. He took the responsibility of managing intellectual property also related to inventions from prestigious institutions, including Yale University, the University of Illinois, the Skate Kettering Cancer Institute, and the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York City. Currently, Steve has been an active member of the University Club for many years, and since 2015, actually. He currently is a board member and also serves as the co-chair of the Foreign Affairs Group, as well as organizing film night and documentary cinemas events. Now, in his spare time, he enjoys traveling extensively around the world, with a particular interest in the history of Central America and the Mesoamerican civilizations. So on behalf of the History Group, it's a great honor to introduce Steve Bertha, who will share his insights on the complicated history of Central America. Join me in giving him a warm applause.
Yeah, thank you very much for that nice introduction. I've been interested in Central America for a number of years, for a number of reasons. One reason is that it's a fragmented place in America. All the other countries are huge countries. but not Central America. Why was that? Why did it happen that it's balkanized the way it is? And more recently, another reason I was interested in is because so many people of Central America have left their countries. So why is that? And so the presentation here will sort of focus on mainly those two aspects of the history. I will talk mainly about four countries: Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. The reason is, well, Belize is a relatively new country. It used to be claimed by Guatemala, and it's only been independent state since 1981. Panama really never was part of Central America. Panama officially belonged to the to Peru. I forget what it was. Anyway, it belonged to Peru. It answered to Peru, and so it was sort of different from the rest. And Costa Rica, we'll see that it was sort of different from the rest, somehow, from the other four, in good measure because the population was very low throughout its history. Uh-oh. This is not working again. Damn it. I'm trying to make this change from here, but it's not doing it. All right, I can do it from here. All right, so after the discovery of America in 1942, the Spanish, of course, they expanded very quickly. They started exploring all the neighborhood lands, and already by 1511, they arrived in Panama, and they had some settlements over there. As a matter of fact, by 1519, Pedro Davila opened Panama City, founded Panama City. In 1519, Hernán Cortés went to Mexico, found Mexico, and 2 years later, he conquered the Aztecs. So already by 1823-24, there were two hubs in this area of the world that were Spanish hubs ready to further exploration of the area. One hub, of course, was in Mexico City, where Hernán Cortés was, and the other hub was in Panama City, where Pedro Arias Davila, the founder of Panama City, was. Of course, they were totally different because Panama was dependent on Peru, and Mexico City was, of course, dependent on the viceroyalty of New Spain, with seat in Mexico City. So, now it works. So very soon, they sent exploration parties, both from the north and from the south. From the north, Hernán Cortés sent Alvarado on the western side to explore and conquer this region. And he also sent Olid that came from the sea, and the purpose was to explore this region of Honduras and Nicaragua. Almost at the same time, Davila, this guy was Gil González Davila, came from Panama, from the south to north, to explore what is today Costa Rica and Nicaragua, except that he had a permit directly from the from Spain. And he was not sent by the governor of the city or of Panama, who was Davila. But Davila, he sent his own man, who was Hernandez de Córdoba. So he sent his own man both to explore the same region and also to snatch away whatever Davila had conquered. Because, well, these people, all of them, they really were not gentlemen. They were not very loyal. They were perhaps closer to ruffians than anything else. And their only purpose to go in these regions was to get rich. And for them, all the other conquerors or all the other groups that were sent there were rivals because, well, they were going to take away what belonged to them. And so soon enough, this place got congested with conquistadores, and, well, they clashed. And here are a couple of examples. Gil González Dávila, he came on his own, and the other Dávila, the founder of Panama City, sent his own man, Córdoba, to snatch whatever he had conquered away from Dávila. And they clashed over here. Well, soon after that, Dávila clashed with somebody who was sent by Hernán Cortés over here. He clashed with Olid. And the third example, Olid clashed with everybody. Now, Olid decided that, you know, he was strong enough and powerful enough that he would have his own kingdom, and he named himself the King of Nicaragua, splitting, of course, with Hernán Cortés. Now, Hernán Cortés found out, and he didn't like that, so he sent his cousin to take care of the situation. And de las Casas, he went there. In fact, Hernán Cortés went later. Well, he decapitated Ovid and took care of that problem. At the same time, or very similar time, Fernández de Córdoba, he also thought that he was, you know, big enough to confront the big boss in Panama City. And so that Dávila did not like that too much, and so he sent his own people there. Hernando de Soto, we talked about him in a couple of talks before. Hernando de Soto, he decapitated him. And so this was a horrible mess of everybody against everybody, and Spain, the central Spain, the government of Spain, didn't know really what to do with this. So how to deal with these people with different loyalties, with the ruffians, essentially. And so, you know, the region was too far away from the central power. Whatever this region was, you know, it depended on Mexico City, and that was too far. There was no real connection. And Panama, of course, depended on Peru, and that was too far away. So after deliberating a lot, they came up with a solution, and they created the captaincy of Guatemala. He also called the Kingdom of Guatemala. The king of Guatemala, by the way, was Charles V, or Charles I of Spain. So they created this captaincy with a captain general, but with several regional governments in tacit recognition of the rivalries, claims, and disputes of the conquistadores. So, you know, Guatemala, well, Alvarado was the boss there, the one who was sent by Hernán Cortés from Mexico City. Nicaragua, Pedrarias, the founder of Panama City, he was the big boss there. Honduras, Montejo, and there were other conquistadores that had to be taken care of. So this was essentially the tacit acceptance by Spain of the situation in there. But there was more. And another problem here was that even before the conquest, even before the Spanish arrived, this region was fragmented already. It was fragmented by a diverse group of tribes of tribes of the region. So some tribes had relation, for example, with the Aztecs. They were Nahuatl. And other tribes had relations with the Mayas, and other tribes had relations to others or to none. So when the Spanish came from both sides, in order to conquer this region, they had to fight every single tribe on their way. It wasn't like Mexico and Peru, where there was an empire. When they got rid of the emperor, the empire practically fell, and the whole region became under their power. But not here, because, well, if one tribe fell, they didn't care what happened to the other tribe. So they had to go tribe by tribe to conquer the region. And well, by 1543, they pretty much accomplished that, but it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work, a lot of effort, and that is another reason why this region is so balkanized, is so so fractured. So my conclusion, is that the balkanization of Central America is really a product of conquistador rivalries, of course, Spain's incompetence of how to deal with them, and the fractionation of indigenous peoples in the regions that was there even before the discovery. Now, the Spanish incompetence went on a little bit further, unfortunately, and look at what happened in a number of years later. There were a zillion different groups, areas of power, but we're not going to go into that. Let's go back to 1550 or so. So here is the captaincy general, and so they conquered the whole region finally, the Spanish did. But then they found out that, this place is really poor. There's nothing in there. There's very little gold. This is what they really wanted to get. Very little gold, very little silver, really very little of everything. And the only thing that they had, this area, the only thing that they had in abundance was people. And so, well, they focused on that. So the Spanish concentrated on the human assets that they had in hand. They enslaved them and used them as labor in agriculture and mining. They used them as cannon fodder for their wars. They still had wars one with the other and with different tribes. They used the women as sexual slaves. And this is a terrible thing, but they sold them to Peru, because by that time, the Peruvian area, the Cusco area and all that region, was depleted of local people, of indigenous people, because of, diseases and because of wars. And so the Central American groups, they sold their indigenous people to Peru, where there was an urgent need for the labor due to the depletion of the locals there. So in a mere 40 years or so, 50 years at most, between epidemics, abuse, and sale, the population was reduced from 5.7 million, estimated, to 550,000 people. I mean, this is an incredible reduction, 90% loss of indigenous population in 40 to 50 years. And most of these people were in Guatemala. So much so that there was scarcity of labor so much that they started importing African slaves. So that was a terrible blow. Well, anyway, during the colony, because of the depletion of population and because it was poor from the beginning, this whole region was very poor. And Spain sort of maintained, or decided to maintain it that way, because their mercantilistic way of doing mercantilistic practices, they forced these countries to essentially to be poor. For example, no country was allowed to do commerce with their neighboring country. So if somebody in Guatemala wanted to sell something in Managua, in Honduras, the product had to go to Spain, and from Spain they would send to Honduras. That's the way it had to be done. And so for that reason mainly, this region became or remained very poor. In 1700, the Bourbon kings came to power in Spain, and they introduced a number of reforms, some of them commerce reforms, but really they didn't help all that much. Particularly, they didn't help the poor population, the indigenous people, certainly, the slaves and so on. So by the end of the 1700s, people started to become very unhappy with the local governments. And they started having revolts, and some of them armed revolts. Especially by the end of the colony, there were a good number of these revolts of demanding land, demanding some other liberties. But they were local. They were local because of the fragmented way that Central America was structured, because of the low population and because of the provinciality. So they were so local that they never really talked about the oppression of Spain itself onto the colony of Central America. And certainly it never talked about independence from Spain. I mean, probably didn't occur to them at that time, even though by 1808, there were a lot of stirrings about the oppression of Spain, and about, well, maybe we should do something about it in other countries. And certainly during the teens, 1810 to 1820, the raging wars were going on, but somehow Central America didn't notice that very much. And what happened then was that almost suddenly, in August of 1821, Central Americans realized that Mexico had become independent. And said, wait a minute, we are the captaincy of Guatemala, and we depend on the viceroyalty of New Spain, which now is the country of Mexico. So does that mean that we're going to be part of the new country? And so said, well, we got to do something, and so they did. They declared their own independence from Spain. In other words, the captaincy's independent from Spain. And sure enough, 2 months later, Mexico sent a formal request to the Consultative Junta of Guatemala City, which was took care of the whole captaincy of Central America, to accept annexation to the new nation. So what to do? Well, there were some advantages to become part of a big nation. But on the other hand, Mexico was in a state of formation. Mexico at that time did not even know what kind of government they wanted. And so there was this dichotomy, this problem of what do we do now? Do we agree or don't we agree? The request was accepted and they agreed to become part of Mexico. And so they became part of the first Mexican Empire of 1822-23. This was the Mexican Empire. Now, that's a huge country. I mean, it's probably bigger than today's United States, including Alaska. And it's an empire because by that time, the Mexican Congress decided what kind of government they wanted. And they wanted to be an empire. And so they named a new emperor. The emperor's name is Agustin, and he was Agustin the first emperor of Mexico, or the Mexican Empire. So there they were, part of the Mexican Empire. But then, in March of 23, the Emperor of Mexico was deposed. What to do now? What do we do now? Well, one thing they didn't want to do was become part of the civil war that they saw coming after the deposition of Iturbide, Agustin Iturbide. So they decided, okay, never mind, we're going to be on our own, and they did. They created their own country, the United Provinces of Central America. And that was Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Panama, of course, still belonged to the Peruvian part of the world. Panama, by the way, after the independence, became part of the Great Colombia, and then it became part of Colombia, and then in 1903 became independent. It never really was part of this other group until, of course, the Panama Canal had been built. Anyway, so there they are, the new country, the United Provinces of America. And that's what it is. This is the United Provinces of America. Notice that Belize was claimed by Guatemala, but the British had already been there, occupied that, and had been extracting materials from there for a good number of years. Anyway, this was a great idea. I mean, after all, it's a bigger country, and they can exert their power as a group instead of one by one. But it really didn't work. It didn't work. So why didn't it work? Well, it didn't work because Guatemala was the 500-pound gorilla in the room. Guatemala had 40% of the population of the whole United Provinces. It had 44% of the representatives in Congress. And most of these representatives were provincial. Their problems were local. And so they focused on the problems of Guatemala. And the rest of them, well, they just hung around and watched the Guatemalans take care of business and got angrier and angrier and angrier. And so, sure enough, very slowly, there was a revolt here and a revolt there, and eventually it was civil war. And finally, by 1838, they said, okay, that's it, this is not working. And so we're going to separate on each little country. And so they did. In 1848 or thereabouts, all of the countries went on their own. And this was unfortunate for the group because they lost power this way. Now, the United States had a similar situation when they were forming the country. And they had to convince, the rich states in the United States had to convince the poor states and the weak states to join the Union. How did they do that? Well, they enticed them with a couple of decisions. For example, the creation of the Senate. the Senate is a powerful tool for the weaker states. They also created the college, the electoral college, that gives more power to the weaker. And this way, they convinced the weaker states to become part of the Union. But unfortunately, the United Provinces of Central America, they did not have that kind of vision. And so they allowed the wars to go on and the separation to occur. And so eventually, as I said, 1838, they all went their way. And there were a number of attempts to get back to the United Provinces. There were 4, 5, 6 different attempts that never really congealed, never happened. So from then on, from 1838 on, each country had their own destiny. And the destiny, unfortunately, had been sort of very poor, because they went from liberal to conservative governments, one from the other, changing constantly. It was either a dictator of the liberal group or a dictator from the conservative group. There were mostly dictatorships. And so that's the way it just went on. It was sort of chaotic. We'll see, not only the rest of the century of the 19th century, but even beyond that. An example of this kind of chaos was the coming of William Walker. William Walker was an American lawyer, an attorney, mercenary, apparently driven by the manifest destiny idea that existed in the United States at that time. He went to Nicaragua, and he managed to be liked by the local people and by others, and he managed to become the president of Nicaragua. Incredible. Not only that, but he was recognized by the United States, by the President Franklin Pierce, as the legitimate government of Nicaragua. And it was supported by a good part of the locals, the local society. He reinstated slavery and even declared English as the official language of Nicaragua. Wow. Well, he didn't last too long. He lasted about 1 year. A coalition of other groups, Costa Ricans, Honduras, Nicaragua, they kicked him out of Nicaragua. And so it became again the usual dictatorship of the right or the left. American interest after this case was a little bit more on the commercial side. American companies, and also some European companies, German companies, English companies, French companies, but mainly American companies, noted that it was a place where they had cheap land, cheap labor, and they had a couple of interesting products that they could export. And so a number of these American companies, and like I said, also some European companies, they got together with the wealthy group in each country and the military, and they designed an export system, a model, a development model by which the three of them would cooperate, and they would export mainly bananas, but also coffee, cochinilla, which is a dye, and some other products from these countries. They call this the export model. So it was an understanding of the foreign companies and the wealthy classes. By the way, the wealthy classes were all classes, because there were wealthy people among the indigenous people as well. Wealthy people among whites, wealthy people among mulattoes. The wealthy group then is the group that that got together with the foreign companies, and the military who was always ruling. It was always the military that was ruling. So these three groups, they had this plan to benefit from the model. What really happened was that the coalition expropriated lands that they needed, oppressed the indigenous and poor mestizos for labor, and crushed any protest. The original Banana Republic concept came from here, was part of this model. The United Fruit Company in 1899, now called Chiquita, was established in Honduras, followed by Cuyamel, that was absorbed later into United Fruit, Standard Fruit Company that became Dole, and some other companies. Now these companies became very, very powerful in each of their countries. Why? Because they obtained concessions from the government and from the wealthy group to develop this model. So they got land, for example, enormous amounts of land. And with in that land, they built railroads. And eventually, the whole chain of working was in the hands of these companies. From purchase of the land or management of the land to put the seeds, the seeding, the collection, the transport, everything was in the hands of these companies. So much so that United Fruit Company at one time managed Guatemala's post office as well, the post office in the whole nation, in a special contract with the government. And of course, it was very corrupt. For example, in 1911, Cuyamel, this one, where is it? Yeah, Cuyamel Fruit Company, conspired with an ex-president of Honduras, overthrow the existing government, and install a new one friendly to their business. So if the government did not go along with what these companies or this coalition really wanted, they just changed the government. So the power so much that, for example, the United Fruit Company came to have control of 42% of the territory, the land. They did not own, but they had the control of 42% of the territory of Guatemala. And furthermore, they didn't pay any taxes nor tariffs. American companies convinced the U.S. government now, to sporadically militarily occupy Honduras to maintain, sorry about that, to militarily occupy Honduras and maintain peace and protect the corporate interests. Protect their corporate interests. Now, we have to be careful with this because there was something in this that it's logical. It is not that the U.S. government did whatever these companies asked them to do, and if these companies wanted some military support, they would rush the military over there and help the companies. It wasn't just brazen. The truth was that the whole region was unstable throughout all this time. And there was a geopolitical interest of the United States government to have some sort of peace in the region. So, for example, in Honduras, between 1920 and 23, there were 17 uprisings. Now, how can you conduct business in an environment like that? And so it sort of made sense to send military groups to Honduras. And I will see also Nicaragua. Nicaragua was continuously occupied from 1912 to 1933 by the American military. But again, you know, it wasn't that United States sort of imposed itself over the local people. They were welcomed by some of the Nicaraguan governments because of the instability that they had. So, but anyway, the case is that the American military was present in Central America in a good number of times. Of course, you remember that Americans invaded Mexico a couple of times already, and so on and so forth, Cuba and the Dominican Republic and so on. So it's not unusual, this, but I'm trying to explain that there was some reason for the American military to be there. It just sort of made sense. Okay. There were protests, of course, by indigenous people, but the protests were because they did not have land. The land was taken away by the coalition. And so they were starving, they were poor, they could not get out of the situation, so there were these, the protests, uprisings, and so on. There was one particular protest led by Augusto Sandino, 1927 to 33, which was specifically against the United States military presence in Nicaragua. Now, in 1954, now there's a little jump of about 20 years here. In 1954, the U.S. played an important role in a coup against Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala, who was perceived as a communist. Now notice the year, of course, 1954. So there was a switch here of focus by the American government, and it was the anti-communism. By 1954, there were in the government of the United States a number of very rabid anti-communist people, such as Foster Dulles, for example, and others. And so they could not conceive the idea that some part of America, there would be a communist government. And so they agreed, and they convinced Eisenhower to agree to topple Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala because he was perceived as a communist. But what did Arbenz really do? Arbenz was, by the way, the second president of Guatemala who was democratically elected. Now this is 1954. The first president democratically elected in Guatemala was his predecessor, 1946 to 51, who passed on the baton, the presidency, without any fuss to Arbenz. So no, this is pretty injurious to a country that's starting to become a little bit getting out of the typical military powers. Anyways, so what the predecessor did, and what Arbenz really did, was to give land to the poor. Finally, he was returning land to the indigenous people and to the poor mulatto population of Guatemala. And the way he did it was to take away land from the banana companies, the American companies. Of course, the big ones were American. To take away their land. Now, it wasn't as brazen as that either. You see, the 42% of territory of Guatemala that was in the hands of the banana companies, a good portion of that was not productive. It was set aside just in case we need to expand. More than half of that 42% was non-productive land. And when they had acquired it, they acquired it at a certain price. And so Arbenz, what he did, he says, okay, this is what you declared that this land is worth. I'm going to pay you that money. And take it away and give it to the poor people. The banana companies, they didn't like that. They did not want to lose the land. And so they labeled him communist. So the coalition's tactic really was to accuse somebody of being communist, and then these rabid anti-communist people in Washington would go along with it. And so it was really a CIA operation, and this is historical, that eventually toppled Jacobo Arbenz from the presidency. And it became, again, the usual thing of caudillos and military governments and dictators, one after the other, which lasted a number of times. You know how many presidents Nicaragua had in its history from, let's see, from 1828 until 1936 or something? 117. 117 presidents. So anyway, now this concept of anti-communism and to keep Latin America free of communism continued in the American governments, one president after the other. And so in 1980, for example, the United States provided arms, training, help, all sorts of help, money to the government of El Salvador, the dictatorship of El Salvador, to aid in its conflict against leftist guerrillas. Now, leftist guerrillas for the U.S. was communist guerrillas, but that wasn't really true, because what these people wanted was the same thing that Arbenz wanted. They wanted to distribute land to those poor people. They wanted the poor people to be able to have their own production and be able to survive and live better. So, furthermore, the Sandinistas, the ones that fought the American military, they finally toppled Nicaragua's Somoza government in 1979. Then they became the government. But the U.S. considered them communists. And so in the 1980s, you might remember this, the U.S. helped the Contra rebels in their attempt to overthrow the communist Sandinista government. So all this upheaval. From here, after this happened, of course, there was guerrilla warfare in Guatemala. In the 80s, there was guerrilla warfare in El Salvador. In the 80s, there was guerrilla warfare in Nicaragua. Honduras served as sort of a platform. People came and went from there. But the fact is that during these devastating wars, more than 3 million local people left, emigrated from their countries. And about 1 million came to the U.S., mainly from El Salvador. They did some good things as well, or tried to do some good things. The United States government helped the local governments to do something to improve the lot of the poor. So, for example, they did this, an experiment. Introduced cattle industry, but that didn't work because cattle requires a lot more resources, land and water and whatnot, and that just, they took away more land from the needy folks. They introduced programs of vaccination, sanitation, public health, but this exacerbated the population growth. So that didn't work all that well either. It worked, but no. The Green Revolution was introduced, fertilizers, insecticides, high-yielding seeds, this too failed. One reason was the indigenous people were not ready to renounce their way of life. That didn't work. So by 1992 to 1996, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras had enough. So, okay, that's it. No more wars. No more wars. Let's settle this once and for all. And they agreed with the rebels to accept them into society, and the rebels would run in a democratic form, just like everybody else. And so there's light at the end of the tunnel. Finally, we're going to have peace and prosperity. Well, not exactly. Why? No, this is 1992, 1996. Communism had fallen. The Soviet Union had disbanded. And so the threat of communism was no longer there. And so a new model was introduced. Oh, sorry about that. A new model was introduced, and the United States led the introduction of that neoliberalism as a way to get Central America out of their poverty. And so you might remember that the premises of neoliberalism, they're privatization, deregulation, economic austerity is very important in that model, and foreign investment. So this is what these countries had to do in order to be successful in this new development model. Well, to attract foreign investment, the Central American governments, they had to enter into a competitive spiral with their neighbors and other countries by lowering their labor costs and taxes. If they had been one big country, like the United Central American country, they might have a little bit more power and negotiation. But they were individual. And they had to compete one against the other. So what happened? It generated more poverty. And since the lands were never really returned, there were problems even in subsistence agriculture, more migration, more people leaving their countries. So with less income from taxes, from customs fees, and the debt to IMF and other banks, and the demand for austerity, which was a very important part of the neoliberalism, the Central American governments had to drastically reduce social services. So schools, no more hospitals. And so what happened? What happened that the void was filled with NGOs, gangs, and drug cartels. NGOs would be churches, would be the United Nations, would be foundations, but importantly, gangs and drug cartels. Central America didn't have that problem before. It started having the problem after the introduction of neoliberalism. And the big problem that we have today in El Salvador, that half the population is in jail, it comes from here. Now, furthermore, there were two new problems: the population increase and the climate change. Look at the population increase. 1900s, there were 3.5 million people in Central America. And it increased. In 2020, there's more than 10 times in 120 years. And so, again, the land was not enough, and this introduced even more migration. Here is a map of the increase in population. Here is specifically Central America. You can tell Guatemala increased by 101% in that time. Now this is from 2020. Let's see, from 1990 to 2023. 100% in what? 20, 30 years. San Salvador, only 17% because they emigrated, most of them, and they came to the United States, a good number of them. Furthermore, the climate change brought persistent drought, and violent storms. There were 2 destructive hurricanes in 2020. So Central Americans emigrated even more. More than 500,000 arrived at the U.S. border in 2022. So here we are. Here is, in time, the immigration of the United States. You cannot see the line here, but Mexico, there's a line here that delineates Latin American immigration. That increases with time from 1980 on, and it's a huge band. So here we are, 1990 to 1945. The economic models was to produce exportable goods. It favored foreign companies because of the coalition. From 45 to 90, the emphasis was on containing communism. And this is what you saw. From 1990 to 1993, the economic model was neoliberalism. And you saw what happened, favoring foreign companies. And the most recent one was started by the Biden government, 2023. It's called Central America Forward. I couldn't find a lot of information about this, but it seems to be working somehow. Anyways, here we are, and I think we're still looking for solutions.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. And that part of the world still makes the news. Questions from the audience, please.
Steve, we didn't say much about Costa Rica, and why is Costa Rica so different than what makes Costa Rica different? The other countries in
Costa
Central
Rica
America?
was different from the rest, mainly because the population was so low that they did not interact much with the other countries, and also they had some visionary people to lead them. Arias, for example, a Nobel Prize winner, he was president of Costa Rica. So they were sort of a stable island in Central America. That is changing, unfortunately, today, but they're still a different kind of a country than the rest of them. They did not have the violence. Not that they didn't have a dictator or two here and there. They did. And they had revolts and all that. But compared with the rest of the countries in Central America, they were totally separate. They were different.
Yeah, and also they abolished the army. It's the only country I understand in Latin America without an army.
They don't have an army. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I've got 2 quick questions. Hopefully you can expand on those. You had mentioned the Mexican Empire that was created in the beginning of the 19th century, would that be?
1822.
Yeah, okay. The beginning of the early 1800s, and how they controlled basically the entire part of Central America, kind of from Mexico. Why did they not defend their empire in Mexico, in Central America, whereas they did in Texas? They sent military to Texas, of course, the famous Alamo. So that's the first question. Why did the Mexican central government not defend their Central American part of their empire? The second question is, also in regard to the topic, when it came to the entire region as a whole, and you talked about how there were various coups, military taking over, conservative governments, left-wing type governments and so on throughout the ages. Why did they not ever think about creating an economic union type system, a federal system, on the lines of maybe like the European Economic Community, which you have today in Europe, where all the countries could be independent individually, but they would be controlled economically by a central system?
I'll start with the second question, because they did. There is an economic union. In fact, it is valid today, of the Central American countries. Now, I don't know why it doesn't work as well as other economic alliances, but they do have it. They have an economic alliance, and it includes the United States. The United States gives them preferences in importing into the United States. So it exists, but it's not very efficient, and I don't know why. Regarding the other question about why didn't Mexicans militarily go to the south, and they did go to the north, I think it has to do with the wealth. The south was poor, the north was rich. And so actually the Mexican military reached Guatemala, and they were ready to pounce on Guatemala and go in, but their internal strife prevented them from doing that. And eventually in the 1950s, the 30s and 40s, they preferred to go to Texas, because Texas was a lot more valuable.
Okay. I appreciate your research. Great job. But I have to disagree with one of the premises. I think you were much too kind to the United States. General Smedley Butler, I got that name right, Smedley Butler. He wrote a book, War is a Racket, and then he went on a speaking tour throughout the United States, and he documented and claimed all the efforts. He had been sent to almost every country in the Caribbean and Central America several times over at the behest of the companies, United Fruit and Carmen Miranda, Chico Banana, but he went there and put down revolutions or put down oppositions to the people that the United States was supporting to take advantage. And more recently, you have a fellow, and now I may not have the first name right, but I think it's Joseph Coniston. And he signed up with what he thought was going to be a very generous group like the World Bank to go down into Central America and various countries there, build roads, bring in electricity and telephones, and found out that he was part of a CIA operation to build up debt and then put whatever the government accepted under the control of the United States. And the last thing I'll mention is it seems that San Salvador is now a prison for certain people leaving the United States against their will. So I'm not against the United States. I love this country, but sometimes we didn't do so good.
I'd heard of that book. I did not read it, but I read excerpts of it to try to balance my presentation. I also read a book. I have it in my car. I didn't bring it right here. I forget now the author, which is also kind of a rough on the United States government in all these years, from the beginning of from the 20th century to today. It is true that the United States went in there.
Sorry.
The United States was instrumental in many of the big changes in Latin America, particularly the Arbenz one, which is a very clear one that everybody admits that it's a CIA operation. But there were many others. I think that there were aspects of the presence of the United States in there, like I mentioned, that they were actually welcomed to the countries, particularly, for example, Nicaragua. The Somoza government in the 1930s, I think, welcomed the American military presence because they could not maintain order.
But FDR changed the policy.
FDR did the good neighbor policy. Right.
Question there.
Steve, maybe I missed it at the beginning of the presentation, but how were these countries divided initially?
Hold on a second. Oh, shit. I'm sorry.
Were these countries divided geographically? Are there rivers that go between the countries, and did that contribute? Did the geography? I know it's very mountainous and everything. Did that contribute to the disorganization, the chaos?
You know, I did not look into that, and I cannot tell you if there are mountain ranges between the countries or rivers that separate. I don't know. I suspect that no. I think that they were subdivided by the power exercised by the leader of the time. Alvarado, for example, so this is mine, and I just don't know the answer to that.
Wasn't there another question from somewhere?
Steve, 2 points. You mentioned Nicaragua repeatedly. And what's going on in Nicaragua today? Angela, you lived there for a while. And I understand the idea of democracy, even though countries that declare themselves sort of independent of the United States, still they have sort of dictatorships. Like in Nicaragua, the current president has been there for, 20 years or so? Number one. Number two, something that's very current is the Panama Canal. And 1903, United States, during the Teddy Roosevelt's president signed the agreement that was for perpetuity. Then in 1977 or so, Jimmy Carter signed the treaty, or 2 treaties really, one for the transfer of the Panama Canal to Panama, and the second treaty was about the Neutrality Act that will give access to the United States in cases of war. The United States will have priority. Now, what is the current situation there? Because it's been in the news lately. The current situation with the Panama Canal and the United States.
The present situation?
Yeah.
Well, my understanding is that, my understanding, okay, I may be wrong. It is not about the United States taking over the Panama Canal like it was before. It was to contain the Chinese. The Chinese have a presence there. And the idea is to have an American military presence sufficient to contain the Chinese from dominating the whole region of the canal. The Chinese are buying up things. They're buying up land, they're buying up companies all around the canal. And so this is what the United States, this is my understanding again, wants to contain. So it is not the taking back of the canal physically and militarily. It is to contain the Chinese somehow with American military presence and perhaps financial presence as well.
BlackRock company, I understand, American companies now are investing in the Panama Canal.